Have you ever studied English for years and still felt lost the moment someone spoke to you in real life? I know that feeling. In this story, I'll share my journey from chasing the California dream to building a life, love, and confidence in the United States, while discovering a surprisingly simple way to finally understand and speak real English. Stay with me, because one small shift changed everything. California Dream Arrival. Imagine spending years learning English, memorizing grammar rules, practicing pronunciation, and watching endless lessons online. You believe you are ready. You believe you understand. But the moment a real person in America speaks to you, quickly, naturally, casually, your brain suddenly feels empty. That exact moment changed everything in my life, and it is also where this story begins. A few years ago, I landed in California with a suitcase, a hopeful heart, and a dream that felt bigger than my courage. The sky that morning looked unbelievably clear. Sunlight reflected softly off the airport windows. Outside, tall palm trees swayed slowly in the wind, like they were welcoming people from every corner of the world. For years, I had imagined this moment. California, the place many people call the land of opportunity. In my mind, life here would be simple: work hard, practice English, meet new people, and slowly build a future. I believed that once I lived in America, my English would naturally become fluent. Reality, however, had a very different plan. During my first week in California, something small but unforgettable happened. It was a quiet morning. I walked into a small neighborhood coffee shop near my apartment. The air smelled like roasted coffee beans and warm bread. Soft music played in the background. A few people were typing on laptops, while others chatted comfortably with friends. Everything looked relaxed. Everything looked easy. Until it was my turn to order. The barista smiled warmly and said, "Hey, what can I get for you today?" The sentence was simple, very simple. I knew every word. But suddenly, my brain started working like a slow computer from the 1990s. My mind began searching for the perfect grammar. Should I say, "I want a coffee"? Or "I would like a coffee"? Which one sounds polite? Which one sounds natural? Those few seconds felt incredibly long. Finally, I answered slowly, "I would like one coffee." The barista nodded kindly and asked another quick question. "Sure, hot or iced?" And once again, my brain froze. Two tiny words. Hot, iced. Yet my brain was still translating, thinking, analyzing. In that moment, I realized something important. Understanding English in real life is not the same as understanding English in a classroom. When we study English in school, our brain often learns language in a very analytical way. We memorize vocabulary. We study grammar structures. We translate sentences. But real conversations do not wait for translation. Real conversations move fast. People shorten words, they connect sounds, they use casual expressions that never appear in textbooks. Your brain needs training to recognize these patterns instantly, and that training rarely comes from traditional studying alone. During my first few months living in the United States, I slowly discovered something fascinating. Everyday life was actually the best English teacher. At the grocery store, employees often asked the same friendly question: "Did you find everything okay?" At first, that sentence confused me. It sounded strange. Find everything? Find what? But after hearing it many times, I realized it was simply a polite way of asking if customers needed help. At the bus stop, strangers sometimes looked at the sky and said something simple like, "Nice weather today, huh?" They were not expecting a long discussion, just a small human moment. At work, coworkers greeted each other casually. "Morning. What's up? Busy day?" None of these sentences were complicated. Actually, they were extremely simple, and that realization slowly changed my approach to learning English. Instead of trying to sound perfect, I began focusing on understanding real-life patterns. Short phrases, simple reactions, natural responses. For example, when someone asked, "How's your day going?" I stopped trying to create a long, perfect answer. Instead, I replied naturally, "Pretty good, just busy with work." That was enough. People understood me. They smiled. The conversation continued.
Language learning researchers often explain that our brains remember information much better when it is connected to emotions and experiences. Stories activate multiple parts of the brain at the same time: memory, imagination, sound recognition, and emotional processing. That is why children learn language incredibly fast. They do not study grammar charts. They experience stories. They hear conversations. They connect language with real life. Once I understood this idea, my practice method changed completely. Instead of memorizing long vocabulary lists, I started telling simple stories about my own daily life. Stories about getting lost on a California bus. Stories about misunderstanding a cashier. Stories about accidentally ordering food that was much spicier than expected. Every day I listened more carefully. Every day I spoke a little more confidently. Slowly, my brain stopped translating every word. Instead, it began recognizing patterns. And something else started changing too. California no longer felt like a distant dream. It started feeling like a real home. Of course, the journey was just beginning. Because while I was slowly improving my English and adapting to life in the United States, another unexpected part of my story was quietly starting. It began with small conversations, then longer conversations, and eventually one question that completely surprised me. A question about freedom. A question about love. And a question that many people moving to a new country eventually face. Would you trade your freedom for love? But that moment had not happened yet. At the time, I was simply standing in a small coffee shop in California, holding a cup of coffee, trying to understand two simple words: hot or iced. Sometimes the biggest journeys begin with the smallest conversations, and this was only the first step of mine.
The hidden problem learners face. Silence can be very loud when you live in a new country. Not the peaceful silence of a quiet beach or a calm evening. I mean the strange silence that appears when people are talking around you and you understand almost nothing. That silence followed me everywhere during my first months in the United States. On the bus, at the supermarket, inside the office break room. People were speaking English, of course, but their conversations moved like fast water in a river. Words flowed together, sounds connected. Sentences ended before my brain had time to catch them. And the strangest part? I had studied English for years before coming to America. I knew grammar rules. I knew many vocabulary words. If someone gave me a written sentence, I could probably understand it. But real spoken English felt completely different. One afternoon at work, I experienced a moment that perfectly showed this problem. Two coworkers were standing near the coffee machine. They were laughing about something that happened earlier that day. One of them said quickly, "Man, that meeting ran way longer than I expected." The other replied, "Yeah, tell me about it. I thought it would never end." Both sentences were simple, nothing complicated. But in that moment, my brain could not process the speed. The words blended together like one long sound. Instead of hearing separate words, I heard something like, "Man, that meeting ran way longer than I expected." Then the second voice, "Yeah, tell me about it. I thought it would never end." By the time my brain finished decoding the first sentence, the conversation had already moved on. This experience is actually very common for language learners. Linguists sometimes call this the processing gap. Your knowledge exists, your vocabulary exists, but your brain cannot process spoken language fast enough in real time. It is like trying to watch a movie while the subtitles appear 3 seconds late. The story is there, but your brain feels constantly behind. For many learners, this moment becomes extremely frustrating. Some people even begin to believe something negative about themselves. Maybe my brain is not good at languages. Maybe I started too late. Maybe fluency is only possible for talented people. But science tells us a very different story. The problem is rarely intelligence. The problem is training. When we study language only through reading and grammar exercises, the brain develops what researchers call passive knowledge. Passive knowledge means you can recognize information when you see it slowly, but real conversation requires active processing. Active processing means your brain must recognize sounds instantly, connect them to meaning, and respond, all within seconds. That skill requires a different kind of practice. And interestingly, life in America slowly began teaching me that lesson. One evening, after a long day of work, I went to a local grocery store near my apartment. The The store was busy. Shopping carts rolled across the floor. Families were choosing vegetables. Children were asking for snacks. I walked toward the checkout line. When it was my turn, the cashier looked at me and asked something quickly. At first, I only heard a blur of sounds. But this time, something different happened. Because I had heard this sentence before, many times. "Did you find everything okay?" Suddenly, my brain recognized the entire pattern. Instead of translating each word, I understood the meaning immediately, and I answered naturally. "Yes, everything was great, thank you." The conversation lasted only 5 seconds, but in my mind, it felt like a major victory. That moment taught me something powerful. Your brain learns language through patterns and repetition, not just through memorization. When you hear the same real-life phrases again and again, your brain begins to store them as complete units. Just like music. When you hear a familiar song, you do not analyze every note. You recognize the melody instantly. Spoken English works in a very similar way. After that realization, I started paying attention to everyday phrases people used in normal situations. At work, "Could you give me a hand with this?" At restaurants, "For here or to go?" At stores, "Do you need a bag?" These sentences were short, simple, practical, but they appeared everywhere. The more I heard them, the faster my brain recognized them. And slowly, something interesting happened. The silence that once felt uncomfortable started disappearing. Instead of hearing random noise, I began recognizing familiar patterns inside conversations. Of course, my English was still far from perfect. I still misunderstood things. Sometimes people spoke too quickly. Sometimes slang expressions confused me. But the difference was psychological. Before, I felt like an outsider listening to a language that did not belong to me. Now, I felt like a beginner slowly joining the conversation. And that small shift in mindset made a huge difference. Psychologists often explain that motivation grows when we experience small, visible progress. Not giant breakthroughs, just tiny improvements. Understanding one extra sentence, responding 1 second faster, feeling one moment of confidence. These small wins slowly build momentum, and momentum changes everything. Without realizing it, my English practice was no longer happening only during study time. It was happening during life. On the bus, at work, inside coffee shops, while ordering food, everyday conversations became my classroom. And strangely enough, those small conversations were also quietly shaping another part of my life. Because one of those conversations, with someone I did not expect, would soon lead to something much bigger. Something that made me question not only my English journey, but my entire idea of freedom. A different way to learn English. Most people believe learning English means sitting at a desk, opening a textbook, and memorizing grammar rules for hours. For a long time, I believed the same thing. But life in the United States slowly showed me something unexpected. The real secret to understanding English was not studying harder. It was changing the way my brain experienced the language. One evening in California, after another long day of work, I walked home through my quiet neighborhood. The air was cool, streetlights glowed softly above the sidewalks. Somewhere in the distance, a car passed slowly down the road. It was one of those calm moments when your mind finally has space to think. That night, I asked myself a simple question. Why do children learn languages so quickly, while adults often struggle for years? Children do not memorize long vocabulary lists. They do not practice grammar exercises, yet within a few years, they can speak naturally, confidently, and without fear. The answer is surprisingly simple. Children learn through stories, through daily experiences, through emotions and repetition. Neuroscience research shows that when the brain hears a story, multiple areas become active at the same time: language centers, memory systems, emotional responses, and imagination. This combination makes the brain remember information much more easily. In other words, stories are not just entertainment, they are powerful learning tools. That realization slowly changed the way I practiced English. Instead of studying isolated sentences from textbooks, I started doing something much simpler. I began telling small stories about my own life. Nothing dramatic, nothing complicated, just simple moments from everyday life in America. For example, one night I practiced telling a short story out loud in my apartment. My name is, and today I went to the grocery store. That was the beginning. Then I continued slowly. The store was very busy. Many people were shopping after work. My basket was small, so I could not buy too many things. I found apples, bread, and some milk. These sentences were extremely simple. But something interesting happened when I practiced them. Because they were connected together like a story, my brain remembered them much more easily. Instead of learning random words, I was learning meaning. Instead of memorizing grammar rules, I was using language naturally. Little by little, I started creating more stories. Stories about getting lost on the bus. Stories about my first day at work. Stories about misunderstanding a joke someone told. Sometimes I even laughed at my own mistakes. And that laughter was important, because one of the biggest obstacles in language learning is fear. Fear of saying something wrong. Fear of sounding strange. Fear of being judged. But when you turn language practice into storytelling, something changes. It becomes playful, curious, human. Your goal is no longer perfection. Your goal becomes communication. Psychologists who study learning often explain that the brain remembers information much better when emotion is involved. Embarrassing moments, funny situations, unexpected surprises. These emotional experiences help the brain store memories more deeply, and that is exactly what storytelling does. It connects language to real life. After several weeks of practicing this way, I noticed another surprising change. My listening ability improved faster. At first, this seemed strange. I was practicing speaking, so why was my listening improving? The reason is connected to how the brain processes patterns. When you create stories using simple sentence structures again and again, your brain becomes familiar with those patterns. Then, when you hear similar patterns in real conversations, recognition becomes much faster. For example, I often practice sentences like, "Yesterday I went to," "This morning I saw," "Later that day I realized." These simple structures appear constantly in everyday English, so when people around me spoke naturally, my brain began recognizing those patterns immediately. The language no longer sounded like random noise. It sounded like familiar shapes. This process is sometimes called pattern recognition learning. Your brain starts identifying groups of words instead of individual vocabulary items. That ability dramatically increases listening speed, and listening speed is the key to understanding real conversations. Slowly, everyday life in California became my language laboratory. At coffee shops, I listened carefully to how people ordered drinks. At grocery stores, I noticed how customers spoke with cashiers. At work, I observed how coworkers told small stories about their day. Many of those stories were incredibly simple. Traffic was terrible this morning. My dog woke me up too early. I tried a new restaurant yesterday. Short, natural, human. Once I understood this pattern, my confidence started growing. I no longer felt like a student struggling to speak perfect English. Instead, I felt like a storyteller sharing simple pieces of life. And interestingly, those small stories started connecting me with people. One afternoon at a cafe, someone sitting near me overheard a short conversation I was having with the barista. After a few minutes, that person smiled and said something friendly. "Sounds like you're getting pretty comfortable with English." That simple comment surprised me, because inside my mind, I still felt like a beginner. But from the outside, something was clearly changing. Conversations were becoming easier. Smiles were appearing more often. And without realizing it, one of those casual conversations was about to lead me towards someone who would play an unexpected role in my life. At that time, I was only focused on improving my English, building my career, enjoying my freedom in California. But life sometimes introduces new chapters when we least expect them. And soon, a simple conversation, in very simple English, would quietly begin a story I never planned. A story that would eventually ask me a question I had never seriously considered before. Would I be willing to trade my independence for love? But that question had not appeared yet. At that moment, I was simply practicing something small, telling simple stories, listening carefully, and slowly discovering that language learning is not really about mastering words. It is about understanding life.
Real-life English in America. Textbooks often teach English like a carefully organized museum. Every sentence is clean, every grammar rule is clear, every conversation sounds perfectly polite and perfectly complete. Real life in America is nothing like that museum. Instead, it feels more like a busy street market where words bump into each other, sentences get shortened, and people speak faster than your brain expects. The first time I truly noticed this difference happened during an ordinary afternoon at work. A coworker walked past my desk and asked casually, "Hey, you good?" 3 tiny words, but my brain immediately started analyzing them. You? Good? Good what? Good work? Good mood? Good health? The sentence did not match the grammar patterns I had studied for years. After a short moment, I realized something surprising. "Hey, you good?" simply meant, "Are you okay?" Or sometimes, "Do you need help?" The grammar was incomplete, but the meaning was clear to native speakers. And suddenly, I understood something important about everyday English in America. People do not always speak in full sentences. They speak in compressed meaning. Language becomes shorter, faster, and more efficient. Instead of saying, "Are you feeling tired today?" someone might say, "You tired?" Instead of, "Do you want something to drink?" they might simply say, "Want a drink?" At first, this style of speaking can confuse language learners. It feels like grammar rules are being broken. But linguists explain that natural conversation often removes unnecessary words because the context already provides meaning. The brain fills in the missing pieces automatically. Once I understood this idea, something interesting happened. I stopped expecting English to sound perfect. Instead, I started listening for meaning, and California became the perfect classroom. Every place I visited offered a new listening lesson. At the supermarket, I often heard employees say, "Next in line." Not, "The next customer in line may come forward now." Just 3 simple words. Next, in, line. Everyone understood immediately. At restaurants, servers walked by tables asking, "Everything good?" Not, "Is everything satisfactory with your meal?" Just 2 words. Everything good? Short, efficient, friendly. At first, my brain struggled to process these short phrases because they did not match traditional grammar structures. But over time, my brain adapted. Psychologists call this context-based comprehension. Instead of understanding language only through grammar rules, your brain learns to use environment, tone of voice, facial expressions, and situation clues. Imagine someone holding a coffee cup and asking, "More?" You instantly understand the question without needing a full sentence. Your brain fills in the missing structure automatically. This ability is exactly how children learn language so quickly. They observe situations, they connect words to actions, and their brain builds meaning naturally. Living in California slowly trained my brain in the same way. One afternoon, I walked into a busy sandwich shop during lunch hour. The line moved quickly. People ordered food in rapid conversations. The employee behind the counter spoke with amazing speed. "What can I get for ya?" "Turkey sandwich." "Wheat or white?" "Wheat." "Chips or cookie?" "Cookie." The entire conversation lasted maybe 15 seconds. Short sentences, short questions, short answers. But the communication was perfectly clear. Watching this interaction felt like observing a fast dance. Every movement was efficient. Every word had a purpose. That moment taught me another important lesson about learning English. Fluency does not always mean speaking longer sentences. Sometimes fluency means speaking simpler sentences faster. Language learning researchers often explain that beginners try to sound advanced too early. They search for complicated vocabulary. They build long sentences. But real communication often prefers simplicity. "Sounds good." "Got it." "No problem." "Let's go." These small expressions appear everywhere in American daily life. Once your brain recognizes them instantly, conversations start feeling much easier. During those early months in California, I made a habit of noticing these phrases. I wrote them down. I practiced saying them out loud. Sometimes I even repeated them quietly while walking home. And slowly, those short expressions became part of my natural speech. Another interesting discovery appeared during my time observing conversations at coffee shops. Americans often begin interactions with small talk. Small talk may seem unimportant, but it actually plays a huge role in communication. At cafes, I frequently heard simple openers like, "Busy today?" "Long line, huh?" "Good weather today." These sentences were not deep conversations, but they created connection. They opened doors for communication, and they provided perfect listening practice, because the topics were predictable. Weather, work, food, daily life. Your brain could easily follow the meaning. Little by little, I realized something powerful. English was no longer just a subject I studied. It had become a tool for living, for connecting, for sharing small moments with strangers. The more I listened to real-life conversations, the more comfortable I felt speaking. And the more comfortable I felt speaking, the more opportunities appeared to practice. It was a cycle. Listen, understand, respond, connect. Without noticing it, my confidence was growing. California no longer felt like a place where I was trying to survive linguistically. It felt like a place where I was learning how people truly communicate. Of course, language was only one part of my journey.
because during this time, another unexpected chapter of my life was quietly approaching. A chapter that would begin in a place I visited almost every morning, a small coffee shop, a simple routine, and a conversation that would eventually change the direction of my story in ways I never predicted. At that time, I thought I was only improving my English, but life was slowly preparing something else, something much more personal, something that would make me ask a question I had never seriously considered before. What happens when language learning leads to love?
The coffee shop practice. Some language classrooms have whiteboards. Some have textbooks and grammar charts. Mine had the smell of fresh coffee, the quiet sound of espresso machines, and a long wooden table near the window. That small coffee shop in California slowly became my favorite English classroom. At first, I did not plan it that way. I simply needed a place to sit, relax, and observe the rhythm of everyday American life. But something interesting happened after I started visiting that cafe regularly. It turned into the perfect place to practice listening and speaking English naturally. Every morning before work, I would walk into the cafe, order a coffee, and sit near the window. The sunlight often poured through the glass, warming the wooden floor. People came and went constantly. Students with backpacks, professionals with laptops, neighbors greeting each other casually. And every single person was speaking English in a slightly different way. Some people spoke quickly. Some people spoke slowly. Some used slang. Others spoke very clearly. At first, I mostly listened. Listening without pressure. Listening without trying to translate every word. Language researchers often explain that relaxed listening is one of the most powerful ways to train the brain. When you are not stressed, your brain absorbs patterns more easily. And a coffee shop is perfect for that kind of listening. You hear real conversations, natural rhythm, authentic vocabulary. One morning, while waiting in line to order coffee, I heard two friends talking in front of me. One of them said, "I barely slept last night." The other replied, "Same here. My dog kept barking." The conversation continued naturally. "I think I need another coffee." "Yeah, me too." Simple sentences, short ideas, but the rhythm felt smooth and comfortable. Instead of trying to analyze grammar, I started focusing on the melody of English, the pauses, the tone, the way people connected words together. And slowly, my brain began recognizing familiar patterns. Soon I started practicing something new. Instead of only listening, I began participating in tiny conversations. Nothing complicated, just small moments. When the barista handed me my drink, I would smile and say, "Thanks, looks busy today." Sometimes the barista replied, "Yeah, mornings are always like this." A very short conversation, but extremely valuable, because real practice requires interaction. Many learners believe they must speak perfectly before talking with native speakers, but communication does not work that way. In fact, psychologists say the opposite is true. Confidence grows after interaction, not before it. Every small conversation trains your brain to respond faster. Every friendly smile reduces fear. Every successful exchange builds motivation. Over time, the staff at the cafe began recognizing me. One morning, the barista greeted me with a casual sentence. "Hey, the usual?" That question surprised me, because it meant something important. I had become a regular customer, but more importantly, I understood the sentence instantly. The usual meant the same drink I ordered most days. Without thinking, I replied, "Yeah, the usual, thanks." That moment felt strangely satisfying, because a few months earlier, even simple conversations felt stressful. Now they felt natural. Another habit I developed at the coffee shop was storytelling practice. While sitting at my table, I sometimes spoke quietly to myself. Not loudly, just softly enough to hear my own voice. I would describe what I saw around me. The man at the corner table is reading a book. Two students are studying together. The barista is making a cappuccino. These small observations helped me build confidence speaking English in real time. Language experts often call this technique descriptive practice. It trains your brain to connect thoughts directly to English words without translation. Instead of thinking in your native language first, your brain learns to create sentences directly in English. After several weeks, something surprising happened. Listening became easier. Speaking became smoother. But more importantly, English started feeling like part of daily life instead of a school subject. The cafe was no longer just a coffee shop. It was a small window into American culture. People talked about work stress, weekend plans, family stories, travel dreams, life, and sometimes unexpected conversations appeared. One morning, while I was sitting at my usual table, someone asked a simple question. "Mind if I sit here?" The cafe was crowded, and my table had an empty chair. I looked up and saw someone smiling politely. "Sure," I said, "no problem."
At that moment, I thought it would be a normal, brief interaction, just two strangers sharing a table, maybe a short conversation, maybe silence. But life has a strange sense of timing. That simple moment in a crowded coffee shop would eventually become something much more meaningful, because the person sitting across from me that morning would slowly become an important part of my story. At first, it was only small talk, simple English, short conversations, but those conversations would grow longer, and eventually they would lead to a question I had never seriously asked myself before, a question about freedom, a question about relationships, and a question that many people living abroad eventually face. If life offers you love, would you be willing to change your plans? At that moment, I had no idea where that conversation would lead. I was simply sitting in a coffee shop in California, practicing English the best way I knew how, listening, observing, and telling small stories about life. Sometimes the biggest changes begin in the most ordinary places. For me, it started with a cup of coffee and one empty chair at a small wooden table.
When life becomes the teacher. Language teachers often say something interesting. You can study English for years, but one real conversation can teach you more than 10 textbooks. At first, I thought that sentence sounded poetic, maybe even a little exaggerated. But life in California slowly proved that it was completely true. Because the moment someone new sat down at my table in that small coffee shop, English stopped feeling like practice. It became real life. That morning, the cafe was crowded like usual. People were moving in and out quickly, the espresso machine was humming, and quiet conversations filled the room like soft background music. The person standing beside my table smiled politely and asked, "Mind if I sit here?" It was a simple question. I understood it instantly. "Sure," I replied, pointing to the empty chair. "Go ahead." The stranger sat down, placing a coffee cup gently on the table. For a moment, we both focused on our drinks. The window beside us let in warm California sunlight, and outside, people walked along the street, carrying their morning energy into the day. Then, the stranger looked up and asked something casual. "Do you come here often?" That question made me smile, because it sounded like a line from a movie, but in reality, it was just normal small talk. "Yeah," I said slowly. "I like this place. It's quiet." The conversation continued naturally. "Are you from around here?" "No," I answered. "I moved here not long ago." "Oh, really? Where from?" At that moment, something interesting happened inside my mind. A few months earlier, this kind of conversation would have made me nervous. I would have worried about grammar, I would have searched for perfect vocabulary. But now, thanks to all those small storytelling practices and daily conversations, my brain felt calmer. I simply spoke. "I moved here for work," I explained, "and also to improve my English." The stranger laughed gently. "Well, you picked a good place for that." We talked for a few more minutes about the city, the weather, and how different California felt compared to other places. The conversation was simple, very simple, but it taught me something powerful. When language connects to real human interaction, the brain learns faster. Psychologists explain that conversations involving social connection activate emotional centers in the brain. When emotion is involved, memory becomes stronger. In other words, your brain remembers language better when it is connected to people. That is why students often forget vocabulary learned from flashcards, but remember sentences spoken during meaningful conversations. After that morning, I noticed something fascinating. English learning was no longer something I scheduled. It happened naturally during life. At work, coworkers shared small stories about their day. "Traffic was crazy this morning. I tried a new restaurant yesterday. My kids started school today." Every story contained useful language. Every conversation created new listening practice, and every interaction helped my brain recognize patterns faster. Life itself had become my English teacher. Sometimes the lessons appeared in unexpected places. One afternoon, while standing in line at a food truck, I heard a short conversation between two customers. "What are you getting?" "Probably the tacos." "Good choice, they're amazing." 3 sentences, 9 seconds of conversation. But those few words contained natural rhythm, pronunciation, and vocabulary that no textbook could perfectly capture. I started realizing that everyday English conversations follow certain patterns: short questions, short answers, friendly reactions. Expressions like, "Sounds good," "Good idea," "That makes sense." These phrases appear constantly in daily communication. Once your brain becomes familiar with them, conversations begin to feel predictable. Predictability reduces stress. Reduced stress improves comprehension. And better comprehension increases confidence. It becomes a positive cycle. Listen, understand, respond, repeat.
Meanwhile, my occasional coffee shop conversations continued. Each meeting felt a little more comfortable than the last. We talked about work, about weekend plans, about favorite places in California. Sometimes the conversations were only 5 minutes long, sometimes longer. And interestingly, these simple exchanges taught me another important aspect of language learning. Listening carefully is often more valuable than speaking a lot. When you listen, you absorb pronunciation. You notice word connections. You observe how native speakers simplify sentences. And gradually, your brain begins copying those patterns naturally. One evening after work, I walked home through my neighborhood again. The air was cool, and the sky slowly turned orange as the sun set behind the buildings. While walking, I realized something surprising. A few months earlier, English conversations felt like puzzles I struggled to solve. Now they felt like small stories I could follow. Not perfectly, but comfortably. That shift changed everything. Because confidence in language learning rarely comes from knowing more grammar. It comes from feeling capable during real communication. Of course, at that moment, I still believed my journey was mainly about language, improving my English, building my career, exploring life in America. But slowly, something else was forming through those conversations. A connection, a curiosity, and eventually a deeper relationship that I had never planned. At that time, I still thought I was simply practicing English, but life had quietly introduced someone who would soon make me ask a much bigger question. Not about grammar, not about vocabulary, but about the direction of my life. Because sometimes the conversations that teach us language also teach us something about love.
Freedom or love? Freedom can feel exciting, especially when you first arrive in a new country. No one knows your past. No one expects anything from you. Your schedule is your own. For many people moving to the United States, that feeling is powerful. You wake up every morning knowing that your life can go in almost any direction. When I first arrived in California, that sense of independence felt almost magical. I could decide where to go, what to learn, and how to build my future. My focus was simple: work hard, improve my English, and slowly create a stable life in this new place. At that time, relationships were not part of the plan. Life already felt full of challenges. A new culture, a new language, a new job, a completely different environment from the one I had known before. But life rarely follows the plans we carefully design. Sometimes it introduces new possibilities quietly, through ordinary conversations. The person I occasionally spoke with at the coffee shop gradually became familiar. At first, we only exchanged small talk, short greetings, simple comments about the weather or the busy morning crowd. But over time, those conversations started lasting longer. One morning, while sitting near the window as usual, we began talking about something slightly deeper. "Do you like living in California?" The question came casually. I paused for a moment before answering. "Yeah," I said slowly. "It's different from what I expected, but I like it." "What surprised you the most?" came the next question. I thought about that. "The way people communicate," I explained. "Everything feels faster. Conversations are shorter, but people are still friendly." The response was a smile. "That's pretty accurate." Then the conversation shifted again. "What made you move here?" That question was simple, but the answer felt more personal. "I wanted a new challenge," I said, "and I wanted to improve my English in real life." There was a short moment of silence, the comfortable kind that happens when two people are thinking. Then came a sentence I did not expect. "That takes courage." Those 3 words stayed in my mind longer than the rest of the conversation. Because sometimes when you are focused on surviving daily challenges, you forget to recognize your own bravery. Moving to another country is not easy. Learning a language in real life is not easy. But hearing someone acknowledge that effort felt meaningful. Psychologists often explain that humans are naturally drawn to people who show curiosity and respect for their experiences. When conversations move beyond surface-level topics, connection begins to grow. And that is exactly what was happening. Over the next few weeks, our conversations continued evolving. We talked about favorite foods, travel dreams, childhood memories, and occasionally cultural differences. For example, one afternoon, the topic of independence appeared. "In America," the conversation went, "people often value personal freedom a lot." I nodded. "Yes, I've noticed that. Everyone seems very independent." The reply came thoughtfully. "That's true, but sometimes independence can also feel lonely." That sentence made me think. Because when you move to another country, freedom and loneliness sometimes arrive together. You gain space to build your own life, but you also leave behind familiar faces, family traditions, and the comfort of home. At that moment, I realized that many immigrants experience a similar emotional balance. Freedom on one side, connection on the other. Language learning often sits in the middle of that balance.
Because language is the bridge that allows relationships to grow. Without communication, connection remains distant. With communication, life becomes shared. Interestingly, my improving English skills were making these conversations easier and more natural. A few months earlier, discussing personal ideas would have felt intimidating, but now my brain was more relaxed. I did not search for perfect grammar. I simply expressed my thoughts. Language learning experts often explain that true fluency appears when speakers focus on meaning instead of perfection. Your sentences may not be flawless, but your ideas become clear, and clarity builds connection. One evening after work, I returned to the cafe later than usual. The place was quieter, the evening crowd smaller than the busy morning rush. We sat near the window again, watching the streetlights slowly illuminate the sidewalk outside. The conversation turned reflective. "Do you ever miss your old life?" the question came gently. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I also feel like I'm building something new here." There was a thoughtful pause. Then another unexpected question appeared. "So what does your future look like here?" That question stayed in the air for a moment, because for the first time since arriving in California, I realized something. My future here might not be a solo journey. Until that moment, I had focused on independence, learning English, working hard, building my life step by step. But suddenly another possibility appeared. What if the future included someone else? What if the journey was not meant to be taken alone? That idea felt both exciting and slightly frightening, because independence gives you control. Relationships require compromise. Freedom means making decisions alone. Love means building decisions together. And somewhere in that quiet cafe, with the soft hum of evening conversations around us, a new question quietly entered my mind, one I had never seriously considered before. If life offered both freedom and love, would I have the courage to choose? Or more importantly, would I be willing to trade one for the other? At that moment, I still did not know the answer, but the question had officially arrived. And sometimes a single question is enough to begin an entirely new chapter of a story.
2 cultures, 1 relationship. Most people think learning English in America is mainly about vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar. But after living in California for a while, I discovered something much deeper. Learning English is also learning how people think, how they express emotions, how they disagree politely, how they talk about family, independence, and relationships. Language is not only words, it is culture. And when 2 people from different cultures begin building a relationship, that cultural layer becomes very visible. The first time I truly noticed this happened during a simple conversation one evening. We were sitting at the same cafe table where many of our earlier conversations had happened. The evening crowd was quiet. Outside the window, cars moved slowly under the soft glow of streetlights. The topic that night turned toward family. "Are families very close where you grew up?" the question came naturally. I smiled a little. "Yes," I answered. "Family is very important. People usually stay connected for life." The response was thoughtful. "That sounds nice." Then came another perspective. In the US, people often move away from their families when they become adults. They build independent lives. That difference might sound small, but culturally it is significant. In many parts of the world, family structures remain very close and connected. Decisions about work, marriage, and life direction often involve family discussions. In contrast, American culture tends to emphasize independence and personal choice. Neither system is right or wrong. They are simply different. Understanding those differences became an unexpected part of my English learning journey. Because when you learn a language deeply, you also learn the values behind the words. For example, I noticed that Americans often communicate very directly. If they disagree with something, they say so clearly. "I'm not sure I agree. That doesn't really work for me. Maybe we should try something different." At first, this style felt surprisingly direct. In some cultures, disagreement is expressed more indirectly to avoid discomfort. But over time, I realized that direct communication often helps avoid misunderstandings. Psychologists who study intercultural communication explain that clarity is one of the most important factors in successful relationships across cultures. When expectations are clearly expressed, people can understand each other more easily, and language plays a huge role in that process. During our conversations, we often compared small cultural habits. For example, dating culture. In America, I learned, dating can be very casual at first. People get to know each other slowly. In other cultures, relationships may move toward commitment more quickly once feelings are clear. Talking about these differences became fascinating, not because one culture was better than another, but because understanding them helped me see the world from multiple perspectives. And interestingly, those conversations also improved my English. Discussing ideas requires deeper language than simple daily conversations. You need phrases to express opinions, to explain feelings, to clarify misunderstandings. For example, I often used simple expressions like, "I think," "in my experience," "from what I've seen." These sentence starters are powerful tools in English communication. They allow you to share thoughts without sounding aggressive or overly confident. Language teachers sometimes call these soft opinion phrases. They help conversations remain respectful and open.
During one conversation about culture and relationships, a particularly thoughtful moment appeared. Do you think relationships are harder when two people grow up in different cultures? The question came gently. I thought about that carefully. Maybe, I said, but it can also make the relationship more interesting. How so? Because both people learn from each other. That answer felt true. Cultural differences can create challenges, but they can also create curiosity. Curiosity leads to questions. Questions lead to conversations, and conversations strengthen understanding. Those discussions often lasted longer than our early small talk sessions. We talked about travel dreams, about childhood memories, about what kind of life felt meaningful. And through all of this, something interesting was happening. My English was improving without deliberate study, because when conversations involve real emotions and genuine interest, your brain focuses on meaning instead of grammar. You listen more carefully, you respond more naturally, and language becomes a tool for connection rather than a subject to master. Researchers in language acquisition call this meaningful focused communication. It is one of the most powerful drivers of fluency. When your brain focuses on sharing ideas instead of correcting mistakes, learning accelerates. Of course, cultural differences also created moments of confusion. One time we discussed long-term life plans. What does the future look like for you? The question came again. I'm still building my career, I said, and continuing to improve my English. That part was clear. But then came another layer of the conversation. In America, people often think about long-term relationships differently, the explanation continued. Sometimes people wait a long time before making big commitments. That idea made me reflect again, because for many people moving abroad, life already involves major decisions. Career, location, language. Adding relationships into that mix can feel complicated. And that is exactly when the deeper question began returning to my mind. The same question that had quietly appeared weeks earlier. Freedom or love? Building an independent life in California had always been my focus. But now, through these conversations, another possibility existed. A shared life, a relationship built between two cultures, two perspectives, two stories. That idea felt exciting, but also slightly uncertain, because relationships require something independence does not. Compromise. And compromise always involves choices. As our conversations continued growing deeper, I slowly realized that my English journey had unexpectedly connected with something much more personal. It was no longer just about language. It was about understanding people, understanding culture, and maybe even understanding what kind of life I truly wanted. At that moment, the story was still unfolding, but one thing was becoming clearer. Sometimes learning a new language does not only change how you speak, sometimes it changes how you see your life.
Honest talks in simple English. Sometimes the most important conversations in life happen in the simplest language. Not complicated vocabulary, not perfect grammar, just honest words spoken slowly and sincerely. That realization came to me one quiet evening in California. The cafe was almost empty that night. The usual morning noise was gone, replaced by a calm atmosphere. Outside the window, the streetlights reflected softly on the pavement, and a few cars passed slowly through the intersection. It was one of those peaceful moments when conversations naturally become deeper. Up to that point, many of our talks had been friendly and relaxed. Small stories about work, daily routines, cultural differences, and life in California. But that evening, the conversation moved in a slightly different direction. The question came unexpectedly. Do you think you'll stay in the United States long term? For a few seconds, I simply looked at my coffee. It was a fair question, but the answer felt complicated. When I first came here, I began slowly. My plan was simple. Work hard, improve my English, build a career. I paused for a moment. But life sometimes changes your plans. The reply came gently. Yeah, it often does. That short response opens the door to a more honest conversation than we had ever had before. And interestingly, even though English was still my second language, the conversation felt natural. Because when emotions are real, the brain focuses on meaning rather than perfect grammar. Language researchers often explain that emotional conversations activate deeper memory processing. Your brain prioritizes understanding the message instead of analyzing the structure. That is why people can often express important feelings in surprisingly simple language. For example, that night I did not try to use advanced vocabulary. I simply said what I felt. Moving to another country changes you, I explained. How so? Came the question. You become more independent, I said. But sometimes you also feel more alone. The sentence was simple, but it was true. Living abroad gives you freedom. Freedom to make your own decisions. Freedom to build your own life. But freedom also means responsibility. And sometimes responsibility can feel heavy when you carry it alone. The conversation continued quietly. I think many people feel that way, the response came. Even people who grew up here. That surprised me. Because before coming to America, I often imagined that people here were always confident, independent, and certain about their future. But real life is more complicated than stereotypes. People everywhere share similar emotions. Uncertainty, hope, curiosity about the future. That evening, we talked about many things. Career goals, travel dreams, the idea of home.
And eventually, the conversation returned to relationships. Do you think relationships change your sense of freedom? The question appeared. That question stayed in the air for a moment, because it touched something deeper. I think they can, I said carefully. But maybe not always in a bad way. The reply came with curiosity. What do you mean? I thought about that before answering. Freedom is important, I explained. But sharing life with someone can also create a different kind of freedom. What kind? The freedom to not face everything alone. Those words felt surprisingly meaningful as soon as I said them. Because for many months, I had been building my life independently, learning English, working, adapting to American culture. All of those efforts required personal strength. But human beings are naturally social creatures. Psychologists often explain that strong relationships increase emotional resilience. When people share challenges, stress becomes easier to manage. In other words, connection can actually create stability, and stability can make personal freedom feel less lonely. The conversation continued with gentle honesty. Do you ever think about the future with someone else? Came another quiet question. That question made me smile a little. Honestly, I said, I hadn't thought about it much before moving here. But now, maybe I'm starting to. That moment felt important. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a quiet realization. Because sometimes the biggest life decisions do not arrive with loud announcements. They appear slowly through honest conversations. And those conversations do not require complicated language. In fact, the most meaningful sentences are often very simple. I understand. That makes sense. I feel the same. Those short phrases create connection. Connection builds trust, and trust allows people to share deeper thoughts. As we finished our coffee that evening, I noticed something interesting. Months earlier, I had struggled to order a drink in English. Now I was having meaningful conversations about life in the future. My sentences were still simple, but they were real. And real communication is the true goal of language learning. Fluency is not about sounding perfect. It is about sharing ideas, emotions, and experiences clearly. Walking home that night, I reflected on how far my journey had come. From nervous beginner to someone capable of honest conversations in a new language. But the journey was not finished yet, because the question that had slowly been forming over many conversations was becoming clearer. A question about life choices, about relationships, about what kind of future I truly wanted in California. And soon I would need to answer it, because sometimes life quietly moves from conversation to decision.
The marriage decision. There are moments in life when everything seems calm on the outside, but inside your mind, an important decision is slowly forming. No loud music, no dramatic scene, just a quiet question that refuses to disappear. For me, that question began appearing more often during my walks home through the calm streets of California. The evening air was usually cool. Streetlights created long shadows on the sidewalk, and the distant sound of cars moving through the city felt almost peaceful. During those quiet walks, my thoughts often returned to the same idea. When I first came to the United States, my goals were simple: work hard, improve my English, build a stable life. Relationships were not part of the plan. But life has a way of gently changing our plans without asking permission. Through many small conversations at the coffee shop, something meaningful had slowly developed. What started as simple language practice had become a real connection. And now, that connection was asking a bigger question. Not directly, not suddenly, but quietly. What does the future look like? One weekend afternoon, that question finally moved from thought into conversation. We were sitting in a small park not far from the cafe where we had first started talking months earlier. The weather was perfect: clear blue sky, soft wind moving through the trees, and people walking their dogs along the path. The conversation began casually, like many others before. We talked about work, weekend plans, a new restaurant that had opened nearby. Then, after a short pause, a slightly deeper question appeared. Do you ever think about staying in California permanently? The question felt familiar. I had asked myself something similar many times. I think about it sometimes, I answered honestly, but I'm still figuring things out. That response felt true. Moving to another country creates many possibilities, but it also creates uncertainty. Careers change, friendships grow, life paths slowly take shape. Then another question followed. What would make you stay? That question made me pause longer, because the answer was no longer only about career opportunities or language learning. It was about life itself. I think feeling at home, I said slowly. Feeling like this place is really part of my life. The reply came softly. And what does home mean to you? That question felt deeper than the previous ones. I looked around the park for a moment before answering.
Home is where you feel understood, I said, and where you build something meaningful. That sentence stayed between us for a moment. Then came a quiet smile. Sounds like a good definition. Psychologists often explain that major life decisions rarely happen in a single dramatic moment. Instead, they grow through many smaller realizations. Each conversation adds clarity, each experience provides perspective, and eventually, the decision becomes obvious. Looking back, I think my mind had already been moving in that direction for weeks. Language had brought us together. Conversations had built trust. Shared experiences had created connection. But the final step still required courage, because commitment always involves change. Choosing a relationship means sharing your future with someone else. Your decisions are no longer completely individual. Your plans begin to include another person. For someone who had spent many months building independence in a new country, that idea felt both exciting and slightly intimidating. Independence gives you control. Relationships require cooperation. Independence allows spontaneous choices. Partnership requires discussion. But something interesting happens when two people truly understand each other. Compromise stops feeling like sacrifice. It starts feeling like teamwork. That realization appeared gradually during our conversations. One evening, while finishing coffee at our usual table, the topic returned again. What do you imagine your life looking like in 10 years? Came the question. 10 years. That is a long time. But the image that appeared in my mind was surprisingly clear. A stable life, meaningful work, a home that felt warm and welcoming, and someone to share it with. For the first time since arriving in California, the future did not feel like a solo journey. It felt like a shared path. I think I'm starting to see my life here differently, I admitted. How so? I came here to build a future for myself, I explained. But maybe the future is not meant to be built alone. That sentence changed the atmosphere of the conversation. Not dramatically, just quietly. Sometimes clarity arrives without noise. A few weeks later, after many conversations and thoughtful moments, the decision finally became real. Not rushed, not forced, just a natural step forward. Marriage had never been part of my original plan when I moved to the United States, but life had created a different story. A story built through language learning, through cultural discovery, through honest conversations in simple English, and through the realization that freedom and love are not always opposites. Sometimes they grow together. When the decision was finally spoken out loud, it felt calm rather than dramatic. I think we should build a future together, I said. The reply came with a warm smile. I was hoping you'd say that. Looking back now, it feels almost unbelievable that everything started with something so small. A coffee shop, a simple question. Mind if I sit here? Language learning had opened the door to communication. Communication had created connection, and connection had eventually led to one of the biggest decisions of my life. But that decision was not the end of the journey. In many ways, it was just the beginning of a new chapter. Because building a life together in America would bring new experiences, new lessons, and new surprises that I had never imagined when I first stepped on California soil. And as it turned out, the story of learning English was also becoming the story of building a family.
Building a life together. A big life decision rarely feels dramatic in the moment it happens. Instead, the real impact appears later, in the quiet days that follow. After the decision to build a future together, life in California didn't suddenly become easier or more perfect. In fact, many new challenges quietly appeared. But something important had changed. This time, I wasn't facing those challenges alone. When people imagine marriage or long-term relationships, they often picture romantic moments, exciting plans, or beautiful celebrations. But the real foundation of a relationship is built in the ordinary parts of life. Morning routines, grocery shopping, cooking dinner, paying bills, talking about work after a long day. These simple moments may not sound exciting, but they reveal something powerful. They show whether two people can truly build a life together. And for someone who had moved across the world to start a new life in the United States, these everyday experiences became the real test of everything I had learned. Not only about relationships, but also about language, culture, and communication. One of the first things I noticed was how much daily life relies on clear communication. Simple conversations suddenly mattered more than ever. How should we plan this weekend? Did you finish that work project? What do you think about moving to a different neighborhood? None of these conversations required advanced English vocabulary, but they required something more important: clarity, and understanding. During my early months in America, I had worried about grammar mistakes and pronunciation. But now I realize something surprising. Most real-life conversations are not about perfect language. They are about solving problems together. For example, one evening we were discussing future plans while preparing dinner. The topic of work came up. California is full of opportunities, but it is also one of the most competitive places to build a career. "Do you ever feel pressure here?" I asked while cutting vegetables. The answer came with a thoughtful smile. "Everyone feels pressure in California." That simple response said a lot. California attracts people with big dreams: entrepreneurs, engineers, artists, students from around the world. Many arrive with ambitious goals. But ambition also creates pressure: deadlines at work, financial responsibilities, long-term career decisions. And when two people are building a life together, those pressures become shared responsibilities. This is where communication becomes essential. Instead of facing stress alone, we began discussing everything openly: work challenges, financial planning, future goals. These conversations were not always easy, but they were always honest. And honesty builds trust. Trust builds stability. One night, after a long workday, we sat on the living room couch talking about the future. The question appeared naturally: where do you see yourself in 5 years? That question often appears in job interviews, but in real life it has a much deeper meaning. 5 years could include career growth, new opportunities, or even major life changes. "I want to keep improving my English," I said honestly. Even after many months of daily conversations, I still felt there was more to learn. Language learning never really ends. "But you're already doing well," came the response. "Maybe, but I want to communicate even better." That desire came from something deeper than language learning. Communication affects every part of life: career opportunities, friendships, relationships, confidence. Being able to express ideas clearly gives people more freedom in life: freedom to share opinions, freedom to ask questions, freedom to build connections with others. And interestingly, many of the most meaningful conversations we had were still conducted in very simple English: short sentences, clear ideas, natural pauses. For example, sometimes the conversation sounded like this: "How was work today?" "Busy, but productive." "Anything stressful?" "A little, but it's manageable." These exchanges may look simple, but they represent something powerful. They show mutual support. They show understanding. They show partnership. As months passed, I began noticing another interesting change. My confidence in English was growing naturally, not because I studied harder, but because I used the language every day in real situations: at the grocery store, with coworkers, with neighbors, with friends, and most importantly, at home. Home conversations often include the most natural language patterns: expressions of opinions, problem-solving discussions, sharing daily experiences. All of these moments reinforce language learning in a way that textbooks cannot. One weekend morning, we were sitting on the balcony drinking coffee while the city slowly woke up. People were walking dogs along the street below, and the sunlight reflected off the buildings. It felt peaceful. "I never expected my life in California to look like this," I admitted. "How did you imagine it before?" came the question. "I thought it would be all about work and independence." "And now?" "Now it feels more balanced." That word, balance, captured something important. Life is rarely about choosing only one path: independence or connection, career or family, freedom or commitment. Instead, real life is about learning how these elements work together. California had taught me many things: professional skills, cultural awareness, language confidence. But the most valuable lesson was something deeper. Success is not only measured by personal achievements, it is also measured by the relationships we build along the way. And the ability to communicate clearly, honestly, and respectfully plays a huge role in building those relationships. Looking back at the early days of my journey, when even simple English conversations felt intimidating, the progress felt remarkable. But the journey was not finished, because life in the United States was still evolving. New opportunities would appear, new challenges would arise, and the next chapter of the story would reveal something even more surprising about the meaning of freedom, love, and personal growth. A lesson I never expected when I first arrived in California chasing a dream.
What freedom really means. Freedom often sounds simple when people talk about it. Many imagine freedom as independence. the ability to make your own choices, the chance to build a life exactly the way you want. When I first came to California, that was exactly what freedom meant to me. A new country, a new language, a new life waiting to be built from the ground up. At that time, everything felt open and unlimited. Every street, every opportunity, every conversation felt like a step towards something bigger. But over time, I began to realize something unexpected. Freedom is not only about standing alone. Sometimes true freedom appears when you build something meaningful with someone else. That realization didn't arrive suddenly. It appeared slowly through the journey you've just heard. The long days learning how Americans really speak English. The quiet evenings practicing simple conversations. The nervous moments when I wondered if my grammar was correct. And the surprising friendships that started with ordinary questions in a small coffee shop. Looking back now, the language journey and the life journey were never separate. They were always connected. Because language is more than vocabulary. Language is connection. It is the bridge between two people who grew up in different cultures. It is the tool that turns strangers into friends. And sometimes it becomes the path that leads to something much bigger, something like building a life together. One evening not long ago, we returned to the same coffee shop where everything had started. The place looked almost the same. The familiar wooden tables, the quiet background music, the warm smell of fresh coffee in the air. But something about that moment felt different. Because this time, I wasn't sitting there as someone trying to survive in a new country. I was sitting there as someone who had built a life here. We ordered the same drinks we had ordered many times before. And while waiting for them, I looked around the cafe and thought about how far the journey had come. Months earlier, that same room had felt intimidating. Every conversation around me sounded fast. Every accent sounded different. Every interaction required effort. Now, those same sounds felt natural, comfortable, almost familiar. That change didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly through hundreds of small moments. Ordering coffee, talking with coworkers, laughing at simple jokes, sharing stories, and sometimes having deeper conversations about life and the future. That is the secret many language learners eventually discover. Fluency doesn't arrive in one big moment. It grows quietly through daily life. It grows through listening, through mistakes, through courage, and most importantly, through real human connection. Later that evening, while walking home under the California night sky, I remembered the question that had started everything. Would you trade freedom for love? At the beginning of this journey, the answer seemed complicated. Freedom meant independence. Freedom meant standing on my own. But life had shown me a different perspective. Love doesn't always take freedom away. Sometimes it expands it. Because when two people support each other, they become stronger together than they were alone. Dreams become shared goals. Challenges become shared problems. And victories become shared celebrations. That is when freedom begins to feel different. Not smaller, but deeper, more meaningful. In the end, the California dream turned out to be different from what I originally imagined. I came here to learn English, to work, to grow professionally. And those things did happen. But something else happened too. Something I never planned. A life story began unfolding in ways I couldn't predict. A story built on conversations, curiosity, courage, and a willingness to keep learning, even when things felt uncomfortable. For anyone listening to this story right now, especially if you are learning English or dreaming about life in another country, there is one message I hope stays with you. Progress does not come from perfection. It comes from persistence. Every small conversation matters. Every attempt matters. Every mistake is part of the journey. Language learning is not only about grammar rules or vocabulary lists. It is about building the confidence to participate in the world, to share your thoughts, to understand others, to create opportunities that didn't exist before. And sometimes those opportunities lead to places you never expected. A friendship, a new career, or even a life partner. So if you are currently feeling stuck in your language learning journey, if English sometimes feels frustrating or slow, remember something important.
Every confident speaker once started exactly where you are now. Confused, unsure, trying their best to understand the world around them. But step by step, conversation by conversation, everything begins to change. And one day you might look back, just like I did, and realize that the journey you started for one reason has quietly transformed your entire life. Maybe the real question was never about trading freedom for love. Maybe the real discovery is this: when you learn to communicate, to connect, and to grow with others, freedom and love can exist in the same story. And sometimes they lead you exactly where you are meant to go. Thank you for being part of this journey.
The story you just heard is only one journey, but it carries a question that many people quietly ask themselves. What if the biggest change in your life doesn't start with a perfect plan, but with one small conversation? In this channel, every story is more than just English listening practice. It is about real life in America, real emotions, and the small decisions that slowly shape our future. Maybe you are learning English, maybe you are chasing a dream, or maybe you are standing at a crossroads in your own life right now. Wherever you are in your journey, remember this: progress begins the moment you decide not to quit. If this story made you think, reflect, or feel inspired, stay with us, because the next story might reveal something even more surprising about life, love, freedom, and learning real English in the United States. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join a growing community learning real English through stories, slow, clear, and meaningful. And before you go, tell me something in the comments. Would you trade freedom for love if it changed your life forever? Your answer might inspire the next story.